I'll be doing an in-depth dive into a psychological analysis of what is known as the actor mentality. Now, based on your understanding of your life, imagine now if the story resides within you and all you have to do is simply live your life. But what happens when you shift the perspective now and you then take the story and take it outside of yourself, such as a actor, which you actively are paid to live an alternate story? How does that affect the mind, essentially? Well, you could say, well, for one, boo-hoo, you're getting paid millions of dollars in order to live the dream, essentially, which is to live an alternate life story than your own, which in itself is a paradoxical nature. How might that affect that which we consider the actor? Well, based on the analysis that we then put these actors into place of high power within society, which then they can dictate and tell the rest of society how things should be based on their so-called life experience, which they are not actively living their own lives. They're being paid to live the story of someone else's imagination, resulting in what we consider a movie. Now, in the idea of the movie itself, you could actively dive further into the story of the movie and see that the movie is a story. And in the idea of the story, you're recreating a universe of its own. Now, from the universal perspective of a universe of its own, how would we essentially reflect in our own evolution and our own thought process? By creating an internal universe of its own. And the more we can create universes of their own, or specifically stories that reflect the same archetype, which is of a split from protagonist to antagonist or logical to emotional intelligence, we then see we can create from the darkness the light, that which alternately affects human emotions, which in the act of telling a story, we then see why we might worship some of these, what we would consider Hollywood actors, because we begin to see what essentially hits at the hearts of all people, which is human emotion. And in telling a story that has human emotion carried behind it, you hit a deeply rooted experience known as human emotion, creating a compelling story. Now, at which rate the cult of Scientology is specifically recruiting Hollywood actors in order to specifically alter their consciousness so they may take on someone else's imagination of what a character should be. You're essentially creating a lower complex as an actor, because you are essentially as intelligent as some of these folk might be. You are essentially taking their perspective of life to a lower state. You're paying them to live according to your imaginative state. And now imagine a continuation of a series over a period of time of, say, 20 years of filming, because it takes time to create series. You might actively see the degeneration of the lives of Hollywood actors the more they actively live the imagination of another story, but yet it has a dream-like aspect to it. Hell, you could pay me all you want. I could be ripped right away. Get to work. Now, in terms of the actual aspect of the Hollywood actor, we then see the complex known as the Hollywood actor, which essentially creates what Hollywood has created within these particular folk, which is of a hollowness of a shell, which based on my imagination, I can then program that individual as the director to reflect the emotion I want it to act for my camera to capture said soul of emotion. And so, at what depth is the darkness behind the cult of Scientology? Well, I'm not going to dive into the depth of the darkness of the cult, but I will illuminate a little bit about how this particular actor mentality now reflects back in you. If you are not actively living the story within yourself, you are living the story outside yourself, which means now when you look at your ears, you're actively, continuously listening to the story, whether it be mentally or vocally. And in terms of the story, we have gotten to a point now where we can literally sit still in front of a computer in order to create the activation of the story, known as the evolution of your life. And in the sitting of life, we have gotten to a point now where society does not work anymore. And so in the actor mentality of things, well, start living your life, get back into the world, start working again. Because we need people to work for society to work. And in the full analysis, in the full swing of things, we would essentially see that left is of a Hollywood mind, which is living another's imagination, portraying for them to live their imagination of what the world should be. In that same sentence, I could refract it and reflect it back to the right, which stance do you let yourself live somebody else's story they want you to live, based on their own ability to draw above the rest of the people? From a higher perspective, a presence of greatness, you could say, a man of reputation or a woman of reputation, known as exaltedness. Based on this particular pattern of perspective, the more you pull above, 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 essentially the higher the consciousness arises, you could actively control an entire population at this particular rate, which is what a politician is. And through the inducing, we then see the actor mentality the politician themselves take on in their approach, because politicians themselves can be paid to be programmed to create their own lobbying system, where they can be paid through higher sources, where they can then themselves implement higher sources, or once again, another's imagination of what the world should be. Now you might ask, how much does this actor mentality repeat itself? Well, that depends on where the money sits, I guess. So a best bet would be at the banks, which reflects back to the same notion that I have been pointing at in previous videos, which is, if money is truly circulating within an economy, which is backed by physical value, which means it's in itself, the money would be generating. The more we acquire the work, the more we can generate our structures, on and on and on and on. But now if the money has zero physical value, then it can be infinitely divided, meaning it loses its meaning. And the more it loses its meaning, the less we care how we spend it. And the less we care about how we spend our money, the less we care about how we are taxed on our money. On and on and on and on. And now we see a perspective shift all of a sudden, because we're starting to question, why is it that we are in debt in Canada if we were actually backed by a physical value, which we are not. We are a digitized wealth system, which means our wealth sits in a computer, which in a computer chip, similar to a hard drive, you could actively say, that's all your wealth is worth? I could buy that for 22 bucks. Damn, that sucks. That's what our wealth is worth, man. Well, guess what? We need to back that up right away. So you better start backing that up. So, in terms of the overall structure of the actor mentality, where do we see this backing up? Well, there's a hierarchy here. Because you see a lower state take place below a lower state, take place below a lower state. And ultimately it is guided by higher power. And that higher power is the value of money. Whereas in right-wing polity, the value, you could argue, is more towards a life aspect of value. And from money or life, we then see where people logically or emotionally respond to. And I could take this actor mentality of this hierarchy, which is the representation of a leftist ideological mind, which in itself is a hierarchical pattern and a pyramidal structure. But in understanding the left or the right, how does that influence you as an individual in your ability to have power behind your vote? I'll leave that up to you to discover on your own. Thank you.